They sleep with one eye open now, not because you haunt them, but because their own reflection does. You were never the villain in their story, though they tried to paint you as such, with trembling hands and shaky conviction. No, you were the witness, the mirror, the one person they couldn't fool, couldn't manipulate long enough to maintain the illusion they draped over every other soul they encountered. You peeled back the mask they wore like skin, calmly, precisely without apology. And now, they live in fear of being seen again, because once someone tastes exposure, once someone has their carefully crafted persona unraveled in full view, their paranoia grows teeth. And you were the one holding the light, a brutal, blinding truth that scorched every corner they tried to keep hidden. They never imagined you'd see it, the cracks behind the charm, the control stitched into compliments, the cruelty cloaked in concern, but you did. Not because you were looking for it, but because you felt it. It vibrated beneath their voice. It leaked through their carefully chosen words. You noticed the way they smiled only when others were failing. You saw the delight behind their sympathy. That's the kind of poison they can't mask forever. And when you called it out, maybe not with words, but with distance, with boundaries, with stillness, they felt it. You weren't just leaving them. You were leaving them exposed. And now, they can't sleep. Not because of guilt, but because of the looming fear that someone else might see what you saw, that someone else might not flinch when the mask slips. Their greatest fear was never being alone, was being known. Truly known. Naked of the persona, stripped of the narrative. Because what lies beneath that persona isn't just insecurity, it's intentional harm. They crafted their image to cover the wreckage within. And you weren't fooled. That eats at them now. They can't erase you, because you were the only one who didn't fall for it. And no matter how many people they fool now, it's because someone saw, someone knows. And that single fact, it haunts them more than any revenge plot ever could. You didn't destroy their image. You simply stopped pretending it was real. Psychologically, people who thrive on manipulation rely on shared denial. They need everyone around them to play along. That's the glue. The second someone breaks rank, the whole illusion starts to collapse. You were the breach in their system, the anomaly, the one who broke the fourth wall in their personal theater production. You stopped clapping, mid-sentiment, and in doing so, you invited the audience to question what they were watching. That's what makes you dangerous. You didn't fight them. You exposed them. You didn't scream. You saw. And the gaze of someone who sees through the facade is more terrifying to a fraud than any confrontation. Because confrontation they can spin. But truth lingers. They scramble now, rewriting the story, injecting new characters, altering timelines, telling others you were jealous, unstable, not who they thought you were. But you don't need to correct them, because you planted the seed, and it's growing. People are watching them differently now, listening more carefully. The inconsistencies are louder, the charm a little too polished. That's what unmasking does. It doesn't need to be violent to be permanent. You made one move. You stepped out of their script. And that one decision broke the rhythm of their manipulation. You were no longer reacting, you were observing. And toxic people can't survive under observation. They sense it in their sleep now, the unraveling. The moments they once controlled with precision, slipping from their grip. They scroll more than they speak. They watch you thrive, even from behind blocked accounts and fake profiles. Because what you triggered in them wasn't just fear, it was exposure trauma. The realization that the mask they've worn for years is no longer airtight. You didn't just see the real them, you left because of it. That act alone told the truth louder than any accusation ever could. And now they are stuck, trying to prove a lie while you quietly lived the truth. You became the one story they can't rewrite. Every other ex, every other friend, every former ally. They have narratives prepared for them, but not you, because your departure was too clean, too informed. It didn't come with drama, it came with distance. And that kind of clarity is unrecoverable. They can't say you were crazy when you never begged. They can't say you were toxic when you never lashed out. All they have is silence, and in that silence, their truth echoes. That's what keeps them awake. Not you, themselves, their reflection, their own voice asking, what if I was the problem? Let them pace. Let them craft new facades. You owe them nothing. You've already served your time in the prison of their performance. Now you breathe in spaces they can't enter, not because you barred the door, but because their costume no longer works where you're going. You've upgraded realities. Real knows real, and they can't follow because their truth is still camouflaged behind control. You left the stage, and now the spotlight is exposing the one still standing there, rehearsing lines no one believes anymore. That's not revenge. That's release. That's the sweet sting of consequence wrapped in peace. They were performing for everyone. Every word, every gesture, every meticulously planned display of emotion was part of a long-running act. They weren't trying to build connection. They were trying to maintain control. To be adored without ever being known, to be praised without ever being questioned. Their relationships weren't rooted in love. They were stages, scenes, rehearsals for applause, and most of the audience stayed silent, clapping at the cues, believing in the illusion because the costume was familiar, the script familiar, the lighting well-crafted. But you didn't sit in the dark. You didn't cheer on the performance. You stood up mid-season and walked out. And in doing so, you didn't destroy them. You interrupted their performance. And that was unforgivable in their eyes. You weren't supposed to move like that. You were cast as a supporting role in their tragedy. Someone to orbit their narrative, react on cue, deliver lines they wrote for you. But you changed the story when you chose silence over confrontation, when you stopped responding to their bait, when you didn't play your part. You became an unscripted character in their scripted. You weren't destructive. You were disruptive. You broke continuity. And now the audience is whispering. The other characters are forgetting their lines. Because the one person who was supposed to collapse in Act 2 chose to leave the theater entirely. That wasn't sabotage. That was sovereignty. They depended on consistency, on you playing along. Their control wasn't brute force. It was rhythm. Emotional choreography. Compliments right before cruelty. Guilt wrapped in gratitude. It was a dance of manipulation they'd perfected, and you were supposed to follow their lead. But you heard the music shift. You saw their smile didn't reach their eyes. And you stopped dancing. Not with an outburst, with stillness, with silence. You interrupted the pattern, broke the symmetry, and without your cooperation, their choreography fell apart. The music kept playing, but no one moved. The illusion unraveled, not because you fought it, but because you refused to feed it. Psychologically, toxic people need mirrors more than they need people. They want reflections of their crafted self, not real relationships. They need reactions to justify their manipulations, need emotions to validate their scripts. When you stepped outside the role, when you stopped reflecting what they wanted to see, they lost their place in the story. You didn't tear them down, you simply stopped acting. And when the mask was met with indifference, it began to crack on its own. Because a performance, no matter how perfect, always collapses without an audience. That's what they feel now. The echo of a show with no applause. You became the glitch, the scene that couldn't be controlled, the quiet that screamed louder than their chaos. They didn't know what to do with someone who didn't take the bait, who didn't try to fix the mess they caused. Your strength wasn't in retaliation, it was in refusal. You refused to be moved by their stage lights, their monologues, their theatrics. You let them perform until they realized no one was watching. You broke the fourth wall and reminded them that real life exists beyond their illusion. And that crack in the fantasy It's permanent now. Every time they try to relaunch the act, your absence echoes through the room like a missing line they can't remember how to deliver. They now tell others you were unstable, cruel, just couldn't handle the truth. But what they really mean is, you didn't play your part. You didn't cry when they needed you to. You didn't beg when they withdrew love. You didn't collapse when they pulled the final thread. You walked, and in doing so, you didn't end the show. You revealed that it was a show all along. You made it visible. You made the lights feel too bright, the lines feel too rehearsed, the charm feel artificial. You pulled back the curtain, and now, they can't find the magic again. Their audience is thinning. The mask feels heavier. The script is starting to rot. They can still perform, yes, but it doesn't land the same. Not since you left. Not since the one person who knew the truth decided not to call them out, but to walk out. That is what scorched them. Not your fury, but your freedom. You were the one person they couldn't fool, and your disappearance says what words never could. This was never real. And now, the next time they try to act like a victim, the room feels colder. Because people remember the one who left without needing a stage. You weren't cruel. You were clear. You were the interruption that revealed the weakness in their plot. The moment you stopped reacting, the spotlight dimmed. You didn't throw fire. You took away their fuel. And for people who live to manipulate, that's worse than attack. That's exposure. Now they're left with a costume they can't remove and a script they can't finish. The performance continues, but the conviction is gone. The applause feels fake. And every scene is haunted by the memory of the one person who walked away mid-act and never looked back. So hold your head high. You don't need to confront them. You already cut deeper than any confrontation could, because the truth didn't come from shouting. It came from stillness. You didn't destroy them. You interrupted their performance. And now, every stage they step onto feels smaller. Every spotlight feels too hot, because they know you saw it. You saw them. And once someone has seen behind the curtain, the illusion can never return to full power. Let them perform. Let them spin. But know this, the story they tried to write for you failed. And in walking away, you authored something they never could. Reality. They never feared being wrong. They feared being seen. There's a difference. Being wrong can be fixed, forgiven, even faked into humility. But being seen for what you truly are, that's a rupture. An unmasking. That's the kind of truth that doesn't leave bruises. It leaves ruins. And when you exposed them, it wasn't a swipe at their ego. It was a decapitation of the fantasy they built brick by brick. Exposure doesn't wound the ego. It dismantles the fantasy. And toxic people live in fantasy. Not dreams, not ambition, fantasy. A parallel reality sculpted to keep their flaws hidden under performance, control, and selective amnesia. You didn't just expose who they were. You interrupted what they wanted everyone else to believe. And that destruction, it was never survivable. They spent years, maybe decades, building the image, the martyr, the empath, the misunderstood genius, the devoted lover. Their identity was not shaped by truth, but by control over perception. They curated moments, they weaponized stories, and the people around them, blind or benefiting, helped keep the illusion alive. But then came you. You with your unshakable gaze. You with your refusal to flinch. You, the anomaly. The one who didn't buy the charm, didn't fold to the script, didn't mistake theatrics for integrity. You weren't loud, you were observant, and that's what shattered it all. The moment you refused to clap for the performance, the stage began to burn. You didn't attack the ego, you destroyed the illusion. They tell themselves now it was sabotage, that you were bitter, that you were broken, that you had an agenda. Because accepting the truth that someone simply recognized them is too much. That would mean the lie is over. That would mean the costume doesn't work. And that kind of reckoning doesn't hurt the ego. It melts the scaffolding it stands on. You didn't take their power. You didn't strip their mask. You simply stopped pretending not to see. You became a mirror. Not a weapon, just a reflection. And for someone who has never met their own face, that is unbearable. The fantasy required you to stay quiet, to stay agreeable, to stay just confused enough to keep them in control. They needed you to keep asking questions while never finding answers. Needed you to keep apologizing for emotions they triggered. They needed you to believe they were the anchor and you the storm. But when you stopped spinning, when your questions stopped being desperate and started being precise, they cracked. That's the part they'll never recover from. You didn't just exit the fantasy, you survived it. And survival means memory. It means witness. It means someone, somewhere, knows the truth and refuses to forget. They can't erase you. That's the itch. That's the insomniac's whisper. They can't delete you from the timeline without admitting how vital you were to the illusion. Because the best actors need a scene partner. And you walked off stage mid-monologue. No closure, no curtain call, just silence where applause was supposed to be. Now every conversation they have is rehearsed, every story retold with edits, every smile slightly cracked. Because what once felt real, their version of real, was proven false in your absence. You didn't just destroy the fantasy, you took its oxygen with you. Psychologically, fantasy is a coping mechanism, a way to avoid the weight of being known. And for them, it became home. So when you flicked the light on and refused to blink, their sanctuary became a cell. The lies, the triangulation, the virtue signaling, all of it collapsed in the face of exposure. Not public exposure, private, personal, one set of eyes that wouldn't look away. That's what truly dismantled it, because lies can survive in crowds, but they rot under quiet observation. And you, with nothing but presence, disarmed the myth entirely. They speak your name now like a ghost story, with tremors, with contempt, with fascination, because no matter how much they lie, how many versions they create, how many reputations they burn to protect their own, they know that you know that one person on this spinning planet carries the blueprint of their truth. You don't need to defend it. You don't need to explain it. That's what unnerves them. You walked away carrying knowledge. And in a world where their power is built on the ignorance of others, knowledge is the only real weapon. They're still performing, but the energy is off. The scenes feel recycled, the delivery a bit forced, because your departure did more than expose them. It disarmed them. The audience may still be clapping, but the performer knows something's changed. They know the script no longer commands the same power. Because you left behind more than absence. You left behind doubt. And doubt spreads. Doubt doesn't need volume, big timing. And you, with that one moment of clarity, inserted just enough of it to fracture their kingdom. So don't waste a second wondering if they feel remorse. They don't. They feel recognition. They feel your gaze like a stain on their costume. You didn't call them out, you didn't confront. You simply left, and the void you created was filled not with loneliness, but with mirrors. Now, everywhere they turn, they see the parts of themselves they tried to bury in you. That's the price of performance. Eventually, someone walks in who knows the difference between acting and authenticity. And that someone was you. You weren't a phase. You weren't a season. You weren't some passing character they could reduce to a footnote in their carefully edited narrative. You became the fixed point in their timeline, the moment they can't erase. Everything before you was manipulation rehearsed in peace. Everything after you is performance delivered under pressure. Your presence marked the axis around which their false identity began to fracture, not because you tried to ruin them, but because you saw them fully irrevocably. And once someone has been seen without their armor, their script, their spotlight, something inside them bends in ways they never recover from. You were not an accident. You were a mirror too honest to shatter. And that's what haunts them now. Not what you did, but what you revealed simply by existing in their world with discernment instead of delusion. They felt untouchable before you. Their lies moved without resistance. Their manipulations went unchecked. They could cycle through victims like outfits, changing tactics depending on who they needed to impress, destroy, or feed off. But then came you. You, with your silence that carried weight. You, with your gaze that dissected patterns. You, and because of that, they couldn't prepare. You slipped under their defenses, not to wound, but to understand. And understanding to a toxic person is far more terrifying than rejection. You didn't judge them, you understood them too deeply for judgment. And that depth, that seeing, it set the timeline ablaze. They now measure their downfall by your exit. Every spiral, every unraveling conversation, every failure to recreate the same high with someone new leads back to you. You weren't just an event. You were the event, the one they can't rewrite, can't reframe, can't edit out with lies. Because while others left with broken hearts, you left with a record, not on paper, in memory, in energy. You left knowing too much, seeing too clearly, refusing to play the villain when they needed one. You left not in weakness, but in full awareness. And that kind of departure cannot be buried under stories. It grows roots in the soil of their guilt. They flinch now, not visibly, but in the pause between sentences when someone new asks about you, in the subtle defensiveness in their tone, when your name drifts into the room. They've created many versions of who you were, each one more distorted than the last, but none of them land, because no matter how many lies they tell, they can't convince themselves. You are a landmark in their personal history, a fork in the road they didn't realize they were taking until the consequences arrive. Every person they meet after you is compared. Every conversation is measured against the ones you had. You ruined their taste for fake. Not by preaching authenticity, but by being it. Psychologically, the mind resists forgetting what caused deep emotional disruption. And you were the disruption they didn't plan for. You didn't just leave an impression. You rewired their pathways. You shifted their internal compass without trying to. You made honesty look too sharp. You made boundaries feel like judgment. You made self-respect contagious. And now, in your absence, they try to recreate the fantasy, but it collapses at the edges because no one else sits as calmly in the fire. No one else smiles with the kind of clarity you left behind. They remember you not just for how you loved, but for how you stopped. Your presence broke the spell they'd cast over their own life. You entered with truth, and truth is not something they ever rehearse handling. Every toxic tactic they used, the guilt, the withdrawal, the rewriting, failed on you. Because you didn't need their validation. You didn't beg for their attention. You didn't collapse when they pulled away. And that control they thought they had, you severed it with one choice: non-engagement. You became the plot twist they never predicted, the moment their entire story stopped making sense. You were not the villain they hoped you would become. You were the ending they never saw coming. They reach for replicas now. People easier to fool, softer, less observant. But it never hits the same, because once someone has known real, they can no longer get high off hollow. You shifted the threshold, raised the standard, and every person they date, befriend, or manipulate post you has to unknowingly compete with a ghost who doesn't haunt out of vengeance, but out of clarity. Your memory doesn't bang on doors silently, reminding them that somewhere out there exists someone who didn't break under their weight, who walked away, not out of anger, but out of understanding.